Welcome, everybody, to a Tuesday edition of Tri-State Sports Talk here on AM 730 KWOA. We got one heck of a guest lined up for you here today. We're gonna talk to Shawn Fury. We're gonna talk about his latest book, Rise and Fire. Shawn, thank you so much for joining us here today.
Thanks for having me.
Well, first off, for the people that don't know you too much, tell us a little bit about yourself and your background.
I live in New York City right now. I've lived out here for 12 years, but I grew up in Janesville, Minnesota, by Mankato. Went to college my first 2 years at Worthington Community College, as it was called then. Played basketball there. Went to St. John's my next 2 years up in Collegeville, and then right after graduating there, came back to Worthington and worked at the Daily Globe as a sports reporter for about 3 years. Then went up to Fargo and went here and there, and then, like I said, came out to New York in 2004 and have been out here ever since, but obviously still get back to Minnesota a lot to visit my family and get back to Southwest Minnesota quite often as well to see aunts, uncles, sister, nephews, nieces that are all still down there.
So what led you to New York then?
A woman.
Oh, well, that's a good reason.
Yeah, no, my now wife, then girlfriend, was out here when I was in Fargo, and we talked about one of us making a move, and she graciously offered to move out to Fargo, but I thought it'd be fun to try New York, and it's worked out very well, and I do love it out here, but still definitely enjoy getting back home and having a little bit of quiet and silence. But
right.
Life in the big city is pretty good too.
I couldn't fathom it, so I would imagine it has to be pretty fun and exciting for you. Obviously, we have Shawn here today to talk about his latest book. Tell us about Rise and Fire.
Well, so it's basically the history of the jump shot and how throughout basketball history it's changed the game from the first guys who started shooting it, and then basically the 1930s when it kind of first started appearing, and then the book kind of traces just every step of basketball's evolution. You can really see how the jump shot was leading the way, whether it's in the 50s when scoring really increased, or the 1970s when you had high-scoring gunners like Pete Maravich, and then obviously today with the three-pointer that kind of dominates at every level of basketball, whether it's the pros or high school.
Yeah.
So every step of the way, it's kind of the jump shot. As I researched, you could really see that was the one play that was kind of the common thing of whenever basketball style would change. That was kind of leading the way. So that's kind of the book traces that, and then there's also some, I think some fun detours and sidelines here and there where I talk and write about many of the great shooters who ever played.
Well, I guess before we get too much into the book, where did the love of basketball for you, Shawn, begin?
Just when I was, I can remember, 4 or 5 years old, and my dad putting a basketball in my hands. I think it kind of started there, and obviously my family, basketball was always a huge thing. Certainly, people in Worthington probably remember my Uncle Mike, longtime coach at Minnesota West, and just everyone in my family, hoops was always a huge thing. And fortunately for me, it wasn't just like I had my family telling me to play. I always loved playing the game too, and played in high school at Janesville, and then had the chance to play for Coach Mike Augustine at Worthington, which was just a blast too. So basketball was always my favorite sport to play, and then when I became a writer too, it's always just been something I've loved watching, reporting on, talking to players, coaches, writing about the game itself. So it's certainly lifelong, being I'm 40 now, and it's something I've loved for 35, 36 years. So it's always been there, and this was just such a great opportunity to explore, this game that I've just kind of been obsessed with for so long.
Visiting here with Shawn Fury, he's the author of Rise and Fire, The Origin, Science, and Evolution of the Jump Shot and How It Transformed Basketball Forever. I am a couple chapters in, and I have to say what I've enjoyed so far. I'm very excited to keep going. But, your first chapter, you kind of talked about, that it's impossible to find out really who had the first jump shot. But in your research, you found, obviously, just so many guys. And I think through just the first two chapters, what I'm amazed with is what the innovators and the beginning guys that really started the first running one-handed shot and really kind of the progression of the evolution of the jump shot and, the difficulties that they faced in being innovators. And, you got obviously coaches that probably saw that and said, well, no, that's not how you do it. I thought that was kind of an interesting part in just these first few chapters. You did a good job of kind of trying to relate that onto your readers.
Yeah, and I think for me that was maybe the most surprising thing about the research was, I knew very, very little about it. Even being a basketball nut, I just didn't know much about these guys who played in the 30s or even into the 40s. I think like a lot of people, my basketball history kind of starts when you think maybe like Russell and Chamberlain. That's kind of where you think basketball history started.
Right.
But there were so many players back then who were really innovative and revolutionary players, and like you said, they just met so much resistance in so many quarters, and that was something that was just fascinating to learn about. And like you said, it came a lot from coaches. Because today we think, well, of course, why wouldn't you jump? It seems like such a basic thing and hard for us to fathom, but
right.
For decade after decade, you didn't. And you followed the coach's orders, and everyone played on the floor. They kept both feet on. They shot with two hands, set shots. And so when these guys did it, it really disrupted the basketball establishment. You had these coaches who, had been around for 30 years or so, and a lot of times they threatened the players with a benching, or sometimes they actually did bench them. But eventually these guys were so good, and a lot of them would set scoring records for their time. Nothing like you'd see today, but back when scoring was, very, very low-scoring games, and these guys were setting scoring records themselves, so they were showing what the jump shot could do. But it took a long, long time for it really to be accepted. And eventually, I write about even in the 1950s, you had, then it became even the media was sort of against the jump shot because they thought it made scoring too easy. They thought it made offense too dominant. And it's kind of arguments you might see today sometimes with the three-pointer, but back then it was the media worrying about, the effect of the jump shot on the game. So it was just really interesting seeing how these early players, and then even for the next few decades after it appeared, that they kind of had to go against, a lot of people who were saying, you shouldn't be doing this.
Yeah, exactly. And I like the one chapter, I think it was chapter 2, focusing on where I left off about, a lot of these guys didn't really know about each other because obviously especially if you're probably a person younger than 25, to understand that really news wasn't 24/7. More importantly, the coverage of news worldwide and statewide in America is nothing like, obviously they don't understand that, that was rare. And then the war brought some of these guys together, and I that chapter I really liked, just kind of the thought of, these different innovators kind of serving their country, but at the same time getting to know and see each other's games was kind of interesting.
Yeah, that was another thing that I really wasn't aware of. And again, it made sense once I started researching and talking, to some, especially basketball historians, and just reading some of the accounts in newspapers at the time where, if you're in Wyoming in the middle of nowhere and there's really nobody writing about you until, Kenny Sailors is a guy I mentioned who recently passed away, and he was from Wyoming, and, he got attention in his state for what he did, but it took World War II before he would see, and all these guys would see other players, because they would play, in the service. Kenny was on a really good Marine basketball team, for instance, and he was paired with another early jump shooter named Joe Fulks. So these guys would finally be together and see each other, and that was the first time a lot of them had seen another jump shooter, because in the games they played, they'd be a rarity out on the court. And again, for us, it's like, well, why wouldn't, if a player saw another guy shooting and saw he was doing well, why wouldn't they do that? But I think, like you said, it was the coaches, restricting it, but then also it was a very difficult shot. If you've never practiced it, like guys hadn't, if they just shot the set shot, it's not an easy thing to just start shooting.
Right.
It takes years and years. And Kenny himself mentioned how it was by 1946 that he kind of finally perfected it, and that was 12 years after he first took a jump shot. So it took, being exposed to other players and different avenues before it finally did start, kind of growing across the country.
And I liked what I think it was Kenny, Mr. Sailor, said too about how he had to learn, because at first he was jumping forward too much and getting offensive fouls, so he had to learn how to stop his momentum. And, one of the early innovators of rising up with a jump shot, something now we don't even think about. But back then it was such a foreign concept, that a guy who had to work on it that long had to think about, okay, what do I do to make those adjustments?
Yeah, and with Kenny, fortunately, there's some great pictures of him. There's one from, I think, 1941, 1943. He led Wyoming to the national title, and then 1946, Life magazine took a famous picture of him shooting just a perfect-looking jump shot. And in those pictures, everyone else is absolutely planted to the floor, and here you have Kenny, and he had a really good vertical. They said it went up to perhaps 36 inches,
wow.
Which, who knows if that's an exaggeration. But
sure.
In the pictures, he definitely looks like he's getting up there. And he talked about how he used the dribble. He'd take one dribble and then really use that to propel himself up. And in the pictures, you can just see how revolutionary that tactic was, because everyone else is just looking up kind of in awe at him. The defender would put his arm up to try to stop his shot, but it just gave him such an advantage that you can see why it really set him and some of the other players apart. Like I said, a lot of these guys set really high scoring marks because they were the only ones capable of doing this shot.
Yeah, I think were you talking about? Did you write about Falks that some of the games, like the guys are passing up layups to pass it on him to just watch him shoot jumpers?
Yeah, and he set a then NBA scoring record of 63 points, and that lasted a decade, and it was only broken once Elgin Baylor came into the league and broke it actually for the Minneapolis Lakers. And then a year or two later, Wilt, of course, came into the NBA and kind of shattered all those records.
Right.
But his record, and people talked about whether it would ever be broken, and they would say, well, no one's going to shoot that many times because, Falks did, when he scored 63, he shot 56 times.
Yeah.
But it was because he, again, like I said, his teammates, they saw that he had this skill and would just feed him the ball over and over because he was kind of so far ahead of his time.
Right.
And again, you think, well, why wouldn't everyone do that? But it's been something he'd been doing since he was a kid. So by the time he got to the NBA, and he's a 25, 26-year-old player, it was a shot that he had sort of perfected.
Shawn, as you were writing this book, were there any, not necessarily maybe chapters, but just moments, anything that in your research or in your writing that, kind of maybe shocked you or at least really kind of caught your eye as maybe a fact you didn't think, just something that really caught your attention, I guess?
Well, I think, like I mentioned, how much resistance there was to it. And one anecdote that pops to mind is in the late 50s, a newspaper writer, Jimmy Breslin, who became a famous New York City writer, but he wrote a column at the time. He was a sports writer saying that the jump shot was ruining basketball. And like I said, it was because it was making scoring so easy. So that was something. You read that in print, an old newspaper, and you're kind of like, wait a second. And then some just fascinating stories that I learned about, just throughout the book that I really didn't know a lot about. A guy named Travis Grant at Kentucky State and NAIA school in the early 70s, who won 3 straight national titles. And when he left college basketball, he had scored more points than anyone, even more than Pistol Pete. And they called him the Machine because he was just automatic from 18 to 20 feet, shot 60% every year. So just these stories of these guys, and he grew up, just dirt poor in Alabama, didn't even have a basketball or a basket, and would shoot into a 5-gallon bucket. So just these stories of these guys and how a lot of times how they started and just where they grew up and how they became these great shooters. A lot of times just working on their own hour after hour. And there's stories like that I really enjoyed, and one that I think Southwest Minnesota people might enjoy is I write about a famous Iowa girls 6-on-6 game from 1968 between Denise Long, who became the first woman ever drafted by the NBA. Her small town, Union Witten, won the title. They call it the game of the century in Iowa, and I think a lot of us remember those Iowa girls 6-on-6 games, just these outrageous scoring numbers. So I had a chance to talk to Denise, and then Jeanette Olson, who now lives in Esterville, Iowa, and she was part of that game too. So just being able to talk to people like that and hear these stories that certainly a lot of people know about, but I think most people don't, that was something I really enjoyed with this book.
Was there anybody you interviewed that you were kind of like, holy cow, I'm talking to so-and-so?
I think Jerry West would definitely make that list. That was just a thrill, and he's just obviously one of the probably 10 best players who's ever lived, so that's part of it. And then knowing that, my dad and my uncles were all huge Lakers fans when they were kids, and West was one of their idols, so that played a part in it. And then also, he was just a lot of fun to talk to. He was someone, I really was very specific in my conversation with him, because he's obviously been interviewed, hundreds of times, but being able to focus really on the jump shot and his thoughts about it and his upbringing, that was just a lot of fun. And I think he enjoyed it. It was, he kind of got very technical in his talk. So being able to talk to someone like that, it was obviously a thrill.
Once again, we're visiting with Shawn Fury. His new book, Rise and Fire, The Origin, Science, and Evolution of the Jump Shot, and How It Transformed Basketball Forever. Again, I'm only a couple chapters in, but I'm really enjoying what I'm reading so far. And I think what I like about this book so much, and why I'm so excited really to read the rest of it, is like you mentioned, Shawn, it's kind of little stories. You're not really telling just, you have a kind of your central, obviously, theme, but I enjoy kind of just the different parts, hearing from different peoples. And I think anybody who's a basketball fan, or you got a kid who's starting to get into books and really likes basketball, really is going to enjoy just this great kind of just, it's like a great historical collection really of how it's still changing the game today. Look what Steph Curry is doing in the NBA. We're seeing guys shoot from farther out now from ever before, changing the game. So I think that's what's really great about this book. If somebody's out there and they would like a copy, how can they get a copy of your book, Shawn?
It should be at most bookstores, whether it's Barnes & Noble or independent bookstores, and then also obviously online. Most online bookseller retailers should have it, whether it's Barnes & Noble's website, Amazon, of course, Books A Million, pretty much any online retailer will be carrying it as well as local bookstores.
Somebody wants to learn more about you. I believe you have a website, correct?
Yeah, ShawnFury.com, SHAWN for the first name. All kinds of links there, reviews of the book, and then a lot of my other stories that I've written over the years if they want to sample that before buying the book.
You got a quote from Coach K, so that's pretty huge, I think.
Yeah, that was. Now, are you? I can't remember if you're pro Duke or anti Duke.
I am anti Duke.
Yeah.
Which bugs Sarah Jo. But I appreciate. I have respect for Coach K and what he's done. I just grew up as a Tar Heel fan, so.
Yeah. No, that was a thrill. My publisher wanted to send it to about 7 or 8 big names just to see if anyone would write back, and Coach K wrote back a few months later and said he really enjoyed the book. And I mentioned specifically, because I write about the three-pointer and how in the book I write about how he was very resistant to it at first, but then obviously he's won national titles by utilizing it and adapting to it, and he readily agreed with that it's a shot that's changed the game and it's changed how he coached. So that was definitely a thrill. Just obviously a great basketball mind.
Yeah.
And knowing that he got something out of the book was really nice to see.
Yeah, and a guy who's constantly changing. I mean, look at just even the last 7 years, what Duke's had to kind of evolve to more just based on, the kids because now it's more the one and done kind of thing. So, yeah. I'm going to leave you with the $1 million question. Maybe it's impossible to answer. Who's got the best jump shot then in the Fury family?
I mean, I think historically, he probably doesn't now because he spends all the time on the golf course. But from everything, the stories I've heard, I think Uncle Mike, long-time coach at WCC, was a real gunner in high school and then in college as well. And I remember playing when I was a kid, and he could still run around. He was still pretty tough. So I'd probably have to go with him. I certainly, feel like I always had a very, very good shot as well. But to be humble, I think I'll say Uncle Mike.
All right. Anything else you want to add before we go here today?
No, just that. I certainly think, listeners in, that corner of the state of Minnesota. I mean, like I said, I hope all basketball fans will enjoy it, but I think there's a lot in there that small town folks will enjoy as well. Because I write a lot about some of these small town heroes. I talk about some people from Minnesota, the McDonald family. Iowa, and then Indiana, obviously, there's quite a bit in the book about them. So I think it's something that will really appeal to people who, just have these memories of being out by themselves, working on their shot, out alone on the playground or out at the farm or wherever. So I think it's a book that, people in the Worthington area will certainly enjoy, I hope.
Yeah, that's the thing I got a kick out of is when you're talking about, the people putting up baskets on the side of barns, things like that. I grew up in a rural farm outside of Okabena near Worthington, and we had 2 hoops. We had one in the hay mounts for the winter, and then in the summer we played outside off the barn. So,
Exactly.
So when I read that, I'm just like, I know exactly what he's talking about. So I think, again, if you're a basketball fan, more importantly, I think, it'd be a great gift for teenager, kid getting, because for me, like, I really started getting into basketball. I think I was probably about... I was 9 years old. 1987 was the first NCAA tournament I remember watching with Steve Alford and Keith Smart in Indiana winning it, and I mean, so that's like 9 years old. A book like this at that age, I mean, I would still devour it. So, I mean, don't think it's just not a gift that a young kid could enjoy, because a young basketball fan at that age would love something like this.
And for you, Jared, I actually had a chance to talk to Alford about his high school career,
really?
but then certainly
That's
that
awesome.
1987 game came up as well. So
again, Rise and Fire, the origin, science, and evolution of the jump shot and how it transformed basketball forever. Shawn Fury, the author. Shawn, we appreciate the time. Congratulations on a great book. I'm really looking forward to the rest of it, and we appreciate it, and best of luck to you, sir.
Thanks again, Jared.
We'll wrap up Tri-State Sports Talk after this on AM 730 KWOA.